It's the Lord's Day. It's Sunday, and traditionally called Low Sunday in the Anglican Church. I always feel the downside of a strict church calendar is that you're supposed to act and behave in ways that don't seem appropriate. Why should this be Low Sunday, a week after we've remembered the resurrection of Christ? And it turns out to be a sunny day, a beautiful April day, and a great day for considering the virtues of Jesus Christ. This is part of my series in the Virtues for a Crisis, and looking at the virtues of Christ in his crisis. So today I want to look at one particular aspect of Christ's sufferings and one wonderful virtue that becomes apparent. And that virtue is the compassion of Christ. I don't like talking about compassion too much these days because I feel it is the most misunderstood of all the Christian virtues. It's the only Christian virtue which I think is approved of by our sentimental culture. But the problem is that the very idea of compassion has been ruined by a culture of sentimentality. Nevertheless, compassion is an absolutely vital motive for Christian living, and it's possible to argue that nearly everything Jesus did was an act of compassion. But first of all, I want to talk about empty, meaningless compassion, and by that I mean those public displays of sympathy which people feel obliged to make. I could say quite a lot about that, but I think an awful lot of what is called compassion is just conventional hypocrisy. And I want to look at one particular incident as Jesus was walking to the cross, the incident with the women who were weeping and wailing following him. Let me read from Luke 23, verse 26 onwards. As the soldiers led him away, they seized Simon from Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him, and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people followed him, including women, who mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, weep for yourselves and your children. For the time will come when you will say, 'Blessed are the childless women, the women that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if people do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Now that's quite a stark warning of judgment, really, isn't it? I've often wondered, why did the soldiers put up with the wailing women? The Roman authorities were very sensitive to any show of sympathy for rebels. But this show of sympathy was allowed to go ahead. Why? Well, because the soldiers knew very well that it was an empty gesture. It wasn't going to lead to a rebellion. It was just conventional mourning. And it's a good example, I would say, of what I would describe as empty compassion. There was no danger of the crowd trying to stop the crucifixion. It was a pointless display. And Jesus' response was a word of judgment. In fact, he said, "Don't bother wasting your grieving on me. Grieve for yourselves. You're the ones in trouble. You're the ones who will say it would be better not to be a mother than to be a mother in the times that are coming on." God's judgment is coming. Your religion is under judgment, and you'll pray that the hills will fall on you. This is obviously referring to the end of the Jewish age, which was going to occur in a few years' time. And Jesus says, look, there's a sense in which these public displays of empty grief are just part of the problem. Anyway, moving along, I think the point I really want to make is that showing compassion is pointless. Showing compassion easily leads to hypocrisy. Compassion must always act. Now, that doesn't mean to say that it has to solve any problems. The act of compassion may simply be putting your arm around someone's shoulder. It may simply be sending a postcard to someone you're concerned for. Compassion acts, though. Compassion is not empty expression. It's not for public consumption. Real acts of compassion are always towards the person who needs your compassion. So let's look at two of Jesus's final acts of compassion. And the first one is a remarkable prayer. The very famous prayer that Jesus prays just as they're tying him and nailing him to the cross. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. This is in Luke 23, again, just immediately following this discussion with the wailing women. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. This is a compassionate prayer. Compassion for people who are not showing him any compassion. And of course, God is going to answer this prayer. God answered Jesus' prayers. So this prayer is in a way an action, isn't it? He prays for the people who are at that moment causing him pain and who will cause his death. He prays for them. And they're going to be saved. I say that because when Jesus prays for people, they are saved. The devil can't have Peter and his friends. Why? Because Jesus has prayed for them, and therefore Peter will be restored. And I think this is not a prayer for everyone. People always love to generalize, don't they? But this is a prayer for those particular soldiers who were crucifying him and casting lots for his clothes. This is a particular squad, and that prayer was answered. We know that because we see it in chapter 23 of Luke, verse 47. God gave the centurion, at the moment of Jesus' death, a moment of insight, more than that, a moment of worship. The centurion in charge of the crucifixion worshipped God and said, truly this is the Son of God. According to Matthew's version of the story, it's not just the centurion, it's other soldiers as well, who at least for that moment saw Jesus as he really was. This prayer shows a remarkable depth of real compassion. Of course, he did say, didn't he, on the Sermon on the Mount, pray for those who persecuted. And Jesus always embodied the teaching he gave. Now, I'm not saying that their ignorance was any kind of excuse. What they did to Jesus was truly horrific. It's no excuse to say I was following orders. And we know that the soldiers who dealt with Jesus added to his sufferings with their mockery, the purple robe, the crown of thorns, the beatings. They went far beyond what was necessary. So they're in no way innocent. But it seems they are forgivable, by God at least, because they were ignorant of the depth of their evil. There was hope for forgiveness. It reminds me of the Apostle Paul writing to Timothy, and he talks about himself as being an appalling person. He says, I was a blasphemer and a persecutor and a violent man. There's almost a note of self-disgust in that, isn't there? But what Paul also says is, I was shown mercy because I acted in ignorance and unbelief. The only person who is unforgivable is the person who knows precisely what he's doing when he acts out of hatred for Christ. But I want to move on. I want to move on to another act of compassion as well as that prayer of compassion. That moment really at the end where in John 19 we're told Jesus looking down from the cross near the end of his first life, looking to Mary, looking to John, saying to Mary, here is your son. To John, here is your mother. Now, this is such a human action. This is so right, and in a way, so normal, that it may not seem that remarkable. Because this is just the sort of thing real love does. At the moment of deepest agony, Jesus says a word of command, a loving command, which is so compassionate, so right, and so wise that once he's said it, it's obvious. But so often we fail to do the obvious. So often we fail to actually say or act compassionately when we could or we should. It may be simple, it may be obvious, but it's a million miles from being banal. It is a creative word, not just a suggestion either, is it? It is a command. And from that time on, we're told that John took Mary into his home, and she was his mother, and he was her son. Now, this moment has triggered so much helpful meditation. So many great Christian thinkers and writers have thought about how this is a perfect image of the way God creates Christian fellowship. It is true that we are, to a large extent, a group of people gathered around Christ crucified and resurrected. But as we come to Christ, we discover that we are brothers and sisters, mothers and children. We are family because we have a common brotherhood in loving Jesus, our Lord, our King, and also our brother. And all of those meditations I think are wonderful. I agree with them. They're great. The church really is formed and maintained as we come to Christ. But all that is true, but today I just want to talk about that simple action. This is an action of compassion in extreme crisis. And it can be a model for us. I heard a news item that said that there's an awful lot of family turmoil and disruption caused by this isolation that we have to live in, this staying at home. It's a reminder, as Jesus looks to John and looks to Mary, it's a reminder that compassion must be exercised towards the people with whom we're most familiar and with whom we have the most to do. So there you are, 2 acts of compassion, a compassionate prayer and a compassionate command, and models. As we have a little crisis, as we bear a bit of discomfort, Jesus' compassion in his crisis is a challenge to us as well, isn't it? Well, that's all I wanted to say for today. This is a blessed Sunday. I miss you all. But we can still pray for one another compassionately. We can still send the odd greeting and the odd message compassionately, even if we're not allowed to embrace or shake hands. God bless you and keep you. as you wait on him.